Everywhere you look, everywhere you go, every moment of every day, from the rise of the dawn to the setting of the sun, from the first cup of coffee to the last bedtime story, at work, in school, among friends, and with your family, during trials and storms, triumphs and victories, on your worst day and in your finest moment. He is near. For our God dwells with us and abides in us. His presence surrounds us, and His Spirit is inescapable. He loves us with an unimaginable affection and cares for us with an unfathomable passion. Everywhere you look, everywhere you go, God is near.
All right, well, good evening. That was kind of weak. Oh. Hard to muster a lot of strength in the middle of the week, isn't it? Well, it is good to see you. As we continue with Matthew chapter 24 and the parallel verses from Mark and Luke that go along with that, let me remind you that we're looking into those things that Jesus prophesied that would mark the end times to indicate that His second coming was near, was at hand. Jesus said that when these things begin to take place, these things that we've been looking at, these things that we're going to continue to look at, when they begin to take place, He said in verse 6 of that chapter 24 that that is not yet the end, but those things merely represent the beginning of the labor pangs, the birth pangs, the labor pains, as he described them in verse 8. Now, we have considered the prophecies of false Christ and false prophets. Those are mentioned in verses 5 and 11. Last week we looked at wars and rumors of wars, nation rising up against nation, kingdom against kingdom, verse 6 and 7. And then tonight we're going to continue with the latter part of verse 7 as it talks about famines, pestilences, earthquakes in various places, according to the New King James translation. The New American Standard Bible that I normally read from, in verse 7 says that for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. The New King James throws in the pestilences or the plagues. And then the New American Standard also says in Luke chapter 21, verse 11, that there will be great earthquakes and in various places plagues or pestilences and famines, and there will be terrors, which are terrible sights, fearful sights, and great signs. These are miraculous signs from heaven. I think it's interesting to note that last week in the first part of that verse, we saw the wars and rumors of wars. These are man-made destructions. And now he's talking about those destructions that are of natural disasters. The end time is going to be marked by these destructions, man-made destructions and natural disasters. And these natural disasters, as we have read, include earthquakes, famines, plagues / pestilence, frightening sights, and miraculous signs from heaven. Now, as we think about those things, as you think about those things, then your experiences with those, either direct experiences or things that you have read about or things that you have seen on the news, they will influence how you feel about those particular things and the degree of importance or degree of concern that you may place on those things when you read about them. For example, it's been several years ago now, almost 30 years ago, that I was at a NASA conference out in Pasadena. I was out there shortly after the earthquake had hit Northridge. I don't know if you remember that. It wasn't the deadliest earthquake in U.S. history, but it was the costliest. About 60 people died in that. And so it was just a short time after that earthquake that I was out there. And the last night I was there, I remember being awakened in the middle of the night by an aftershock. I woke up. At first I didn't know what was going on, but I could feel the bed vibrating, and I knew it didn't have one of those quarter slots on it. I hadn't put any money in one. And I turned on the lights, and I could see the handles on the dresser drawers trembling. So I thought that's what it was. I turned on the news, and they reported an aftershock. And so it was 4 point something. I don't remember now exactly what. To me, that sounds big, but I was, especially being up on the 7th floor in the hotel. But it was just kind of a vibration. But it was kind of a neat thing to be able to go away and say, I've been in an earthquake. Probably most of us have never experienced an earthquake other than what we've seen on TV. Those disaster movies or news reports of places where earthquakes have occurred. And the same with things like famines. We've never experienced famine here in Mississippi. We've never experienced these types of things, most of us personally, even though we may have read about them and we may have some knowledge about them. But my point is that we read about these things, and not having experienced them to a large degree, we tend to dismiss them, or at least dismiss the severity of them, and think, well, they're not that big a deal. Just kind of a side note, I don't know if you picked up one of the handouts on earthquakes in Mississippi. This doesn't mean a thing, except it might be a little fun thing for you to read about all of the recorded earthquakes in Mississippi, and then on the back side there's a map that shows where they all occurred. Interesting to note, there's a line across the southern end of Mississippi from Hancock County, Harrison County, over to Jackson County. It was the discovery that we were near a fault line that led me to add an earthquake rider to our insurance policy a number of years ago. I figured, not going to hurt. I hope I never need it. But we can tend to trivialize these natural disasters and not really consider what it's going to be like in those days, what Jesus was warning about, what he was wanting us to know about. Consider these. These are three of the largest earthquakes ever recorded. In Valdivia, Chile, in May of 1960, there was a magnitude 9.5 earthquake, the largest earthquake ever recorded, and it triggered a massive tsunami that affected southern Chile, Hawaii, Japan, the Philippines, eastern New Zealand, southeast Australia, and the Aleutian Islands. It's reported that the localized waves from the tsunami in southwestern Chile reached 82 feet. That's about the equivalent of an 8-story building. And waves as high as 35 feet, a 3 to 4-story building, were measured up to 6,200 miles away. Sumatra, Indonesia, in December 2004 had a 9.1 magnitude earthquake. It caused a devastating tsunami that killed over 200,000 people in 14 countries. Sendai, Japan, you may remember this from the news, in March 2011, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake that triggered a powerful tsunami that caused a nuclear disaster at the Fukushima power plant. So these are just a few. These are three of the worst in recorded history. To give us some idea of the destructive power, it's not just the earthquake itself and its destruction of properties and lives, but the tsunamis that are created that can reach out across the seas and affect countries thousands of miles away. And then along with earthquakes, we could probably throw in volcanoes. If you got David Jeremiah's book, The World of the End, you may remember reading in there something that he had written about volcanoes. He said in 2021 alone, 2,773 earthquakes were recorded in the Yellowstone area. As reporter Brad Plumer explained, lurking beneath Yellowstone National Park is a reservoir of hot magma 5 miles deep, fed by a gigantic plume of molten rock welling up from hundreds of miles below. What would happen, he asked, if the volcano blew? Well, Plumer wrote that a major eruption could spew ash for thousands of miles, damaging buildings, smothering crops, and shutting down power plants. The states of Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Colorado would be buried in 3 feet of volcanic ash, which is a mix of splintered rock and glass. Such an eruption would make Mount St. Helens look like a hiccup. Some geologists believe clouds of poisonous ash could spread across the United States and Canada with the force of a hurricane. The ash could shred lungs, collapse roofs, take down transformers, and threaten the nation's power grid. it could create a super winter that would last for decades. And this is the potential effect from the eruption of one of these super volcanoes that was described here. And then Jeremiah goes on to say that there are at least 12 other super volcanoes around the globe. So that is a lot of destructive power. What if God caused all 12 of those, or 13 of those super volcanoes to erupt at the same time? And then, of course, we also read about the various famines around the world. Usually we read about those in the third world countries of Africa. As far as plagues and pestilences, we might think of the bubonic plague, the Black Plague of the 13th century that killed up to 200 million people. 200 million people in Asia and Europe. And then there was an international flu epidemic that struck this country as well as most around the world following World War I that took the lives of up to 100 million. And most recently, we have experienced and are still experiencing what I have termed as a pestilence in COVID. It's a pandemic. So when we consider the signs of natural disasters, what if those that Jesus specifically mentioned there in those scriptures were merely illustrative or symbolic of natural disasters in general? What if he's just giving us an idea that nature is just going to erupt, that it's just going to show out? What if it includes, on top of the things that he mentioned, droughts and floods and hurricanes and tornadoes, devastating lightning? What if the lightning would be those frightening sights from heaven that Jesus warned about? Lightning unlike anything that we've ever witnessed on this earth before. Well, Jeremiah points out in his book that there have always been natural disasters in human history. He states that every century has endured famine, pestilence, and earthquakes. Even the Bible speaks of hail, lightning, earthquakes, and of course we read about the flood. We often talk about Noah's flood. So how can we distinguish when these natural disasters are actually signs of the end times? Well, remember what we talked about last week, that Jesus described that these end time signs that he was prophesying of would precede his coming, and he called them birth pains. And we talked about those, how those birth pains, how labor pains increase in frequency and intensity, signifying that the birth is imminent. So even though we've always had earthquakes and pestilence and wars and all of these things, yet it should be a sign when we begin to see them increasing in frequency and in intensity. And so I won't bore you with a lot more data and quotes, but any rudimentary internet search will reveal that these things are occurring over the course of the past century, the 20th century, and now into the 21st century, are occurring with more frequency and with greater devastation. And I think just like the birth pains, we're able to see as these things are occurring with more frequency and with more intensity that we're moving toward something. As you read these things, you get the sense that it's almost like being on a runaway train that you can't stop. It continues to pick up speed, and that we're headed towards something, and I believe that something is the end that Jesus talked about. Now, I would remind you that the worst of what's going to occur is going to occur during the tribulation. And the worst of the worst is going to occur in the latter 3.5 years of the tribulation, that's termed as the Great Tribulation. But like the labor pains, the birth pains that start out and grow in frequency and in intensity, then believe that we're going to be experiencing those things before the tribulation. I believe that we are experiencing those things now before the tribulation. We just don't know when the tribulation is going to come. But I believe that the tribulation will be initiated by the rapture of the church. So that means the church at some point is going to be raptured. Shortly thereafter, the tribulation events will begin, which will be all of these things that we've talked about, these things that we're already experiencing to some degree in our world today, and however more of that we experience between now and then, it's only going to intensify. It'll be like it's on steroids. And so as we think about that, also I would remind you that the rapture is imminent. And what I mean by that is there's nothing scripturally left to fulfill, no prophecies that are left to fulfill before Jesus comes back to get the church. And so that means it could happen at any time. It's not like we have some marker out there and can say, well, this hasn't occurred yet, such and such hadn't occurred yet. When that occurs, then I'll get worried. No, there's nothing left to fulfill. The rapture could come without warning any moment, any day, at any time. And so this realization should make all of our hearts beat a little faster when we think about that. But I would remind us that the purpose of this study is not just to reveal all the bad stuff that's going to happen before Jesus comes back, but to remind us that as we experience all the bad stuff that's going to happen before Jesus comes back, that we're not to be frightened, we're not to be discouraged, but rather we're to be encouraged, and that we're to have the right mindset that we should have as believers in the end times. David Jeremiah wrote, "The way to combat the fear of natural disasters is by supernatural discipleship, which allows the Holy Spirit to flood our lives with encouragement, conviction, and hope." And then he goes on to say that in the face of these end-time disasters, we can have confidence. We can have confidence in God's protection. The Bible describes God as our shield, our fortress, our hiding place, our keeper, our refuge, our rock, our shade, our shelter, our stronghold, and there are other words that you can find in Scripture. So because we are in Him, part of His kingdom, then we can be assured that God is with us and that He'll never leave us nor forsake us. But also, not only can we have confidence in God's protection, but we have confidence in God's pardon. Jesus said in Matthew 10:28, "Do not fear those who kill the body but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear Him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." So because of our pardon, because of our relationship with God through Jesus Christ, then we don't have to be afraid. We can have confidence in these disturbing times in knowing that not only are we saved if we've had a salvation experience, but that our salvation is secure. No matter how stormy the world gets, no matter how much the boat rocks, no matter how hard the wind blows or the rain pours down, we can be confident in knowing that we have been pardoned, that our salvation gives us a confidence that transcends fear. So next week we'll pick up there, and we'll begin to look at the end time effects of persecution. So I hope you'll come back and be a part of that next week. Anybody?